Lewis Hamilton just revealed something that happened behind closed doors, and it changes the entire story. F1 has been selling you for 3 race weekends. In a driver's briefing, FIA stewards privately admitted their own penalty system is inconsistent. Not to a journalist, not in a press release, to the drivers themselves, including Hamilton, who then went and told the media exactly what was said. Here's the exact quote, what it actually covers, what it doesn't, and why it blows a hole in the Hamilton brought this on himself narrative that's been running since Silverstone. Here's the sentence that matters. Hamilton, on the Silverstone jumpstart penalty, we did talk in the driver's briefing about the fact that they're inconsistent with this start situation. There's been drivers in the past that have moved and haven't been penalized. I wasn't out of my box, and they agreed. So they're looking into that for the future. Read that again. They agreed. That's not Hamilton's opinion of the stewards. That's the stewards, in a private room, conceding to the drivers that the rule has been applied inconsistently and that Hamilton specifically shouldn't have been penalized under their own logic. This is a documented admission, not a fan theory, and it's the first piece of hard evidence in a run of 4 penalties across 3 race weekends, Silverstone, Spa, and 2 in Hungary.
A 5-second penalty, and that is moving before the light. 5-second penalty for causing a collision.
Right, Lewis is getting 3 places, I'm afraid.
Hamilton, 5-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane.
Now, bring in the second voice, because this is where it stops being a Hamilton complaint and becomes something bigger. George Russell, the driver. Hamilton hit at Spa. The driver, with every reason to want Hamilton punished, publicly called it a racing incident. But get the full quote right, because the precise wording matters. Russell said Hamilton didn't do it on purpose. He was more to blame than I am, but he didn't do anything reckless. That's not a blanket defense. That's Russell conceding Hamilton held more responsibility for the contact while still rejecting the idea that it deserved a penalty. A qualified defense from the one person with every reason to want Hamilton punished is still a defense, and it's more credible precisely because it isn't a clean exoneration. Then there's Vasseur, and here's where you have to be precise, because this is exactly the kind of detail other channels blur to make the story bigger than it is. Vasseur does not back Hamilton on Spa. Asked directly if the penalties reflected the title pressure, he said, "For me, the accident with Russell, it's a race incident. He can't go on the curb." That's Vasseur defending the racecraft, but he stopped short of calling the penalty itself wrong. So you've got the stewards conceding on Silverstone specifically, Russell offering a qualified defense on Spa, and Vasseur staying diplomatically neutral on whether the sanction was fair. 3 different positions. That's the real story, not the stewards admit they're wrong about everything, but something more interesting, a pattern with cracks showing in exactly the places fans have been pointing at all season. Gerhard Madumbo tells, worst of anything, and they never defend Lewis at the stewards, are they in cahoots? Fair frustration, and you're not wrong that the pattern looks bad on the surface. 4 penalties in 3 weekends will do that. But in cahoots overstates it based on what's actually on record. The stewards privately conceded the Silverstone call was inconsistent. Hamilton's own words, "I wasn't out of my box," and they agreed. Spa is genuinely contested. Even Russell, the guy Hamilton hit, called it a racing incident. But Vasseur himself has not said the Spa penalty was wrong, and the Hungary pit lane one was a clean 0.1 km/h breach Ferrari themselves caused. It's messier and more interesting than a conspiracy, worth watching the full breakdown. It's not as one-sided as it looks from the outside. And if you think that's the last piece of buried context in this penalty run, it isn't. This is the kind of breakdown other channels don't do, because it's easier to just say, Hamilton got penalized again, and move on. If you want every call broken down like this, penalty by penalty, all season, that's what happens here every day. Hit subscribe, and let's get into what the data actually shows. What we thought we knew. The mainstream framing after Hungary was simple. Hamilton is making mistakes, and the stewards are just doing their job. Sky Sports gave him an 8 out of 10 for the first half, specifically because of what they called below-par execution in the races before the break. 4 penalties in 3 weekends. The story writes itself, champion under pressure, cracking slightly, stewards enforcing the rules as written. What the data actually shows. Break the 4 penalties apart instead of lumping them, and the picture changes completely. Silverstone, stewards privately concede inconsistency. Hamilton wasn't out of his box. Spa, the collision victim himself, even while accepting he was more to blame, calls it a racing incident that didn't warrant a penalty. The Hungary grid drop for impeding Piastri. Vasseur's own words were, "We told him, but far too late. If there is a mistake, it's our mistake. A team communication failure, not a driving error." And the Hungary pit lane speeding penalty, the only one of the four that's genuinely clean-cut, came down to releasing the limiter 0.1 kilometers per hour over the line on a system Vasseur admitted Ferrari themselves calibrated imperfectly under pressure. The limit was 80, but the FIA agreed to 80.05 and we did 80.06. One penalty, arguably deserved. The other three, an admitted inconsistency, a qualified but real defense from the victim, and a team communication failure. That's not a driver falling apart. That's a driver absorbing four separate penalties that the evidence treats very differently. Why that changes everything. Once you separate the four penalties, instead of treating them as one story, the Hamilton is struggling under title pressure narrative doesn't hold up the way it's been reported. Hamilton himself doesn't even claim persecution. His own words were, "I've got to try and make sure I don't give them any reason to give me any penalties moving forward." That's accountability, not victimhood. But the steward's private admission on Silverstone means at least one of those four penalties should never have counted. In a championship where Hamilton sits 50 points behind Antonelli, a wrongly applied 5-second penalty isn't cosmetic. It's the difference between P3 and a podium finish that never happened. Here's what actually matters going forward. Hamilton is 50 points off Kimi Antonelli with 11 rounds left. That gap is real, but it's not the whole picture. He's already overturned last year's pace deficit to Leclerc into a small, consistent advantage, sitting 31 points clear of his own teammate heading into the break, and Sky Sports rated him higher than Leclerc, specifically because of that turnaround. Vasseur says Ferrari still has an engine upgrade in reserve under F1's additional development upgrade opportunity, one more concrete step, not a vague promise, and Hamilton himself points to his own history. 2014 against Rosberg, then 2017 and 2018 against Vettel, all seasons where he pulled away specifically in the second half. Put those two threads together and you get the actual stakes. If Ferrari lands that engine upgrade and Hamilton's second-half pattern holds, this steward's admission stops being a footnote about one bad weekend and becomes the explanation for why the championship gap was never as clean as 50 points suggested. Every wrongly applied penalty in the first half is a data point Ferrari can point to when explaining why the deficit doesn't reflect the true pace picture. That's the difference between a driver who's fallen out of title contention and a driver who's been quietly overpaying in penalty points for stewarding errors the FIA itself has already conceded. The real question now is whether the FIA actually changes how it applies the start line rule before Zandvoort on August 21st, because if they don't, and Hamilton picks up a fifth penalty on a call the stewards have already admitted is inconsistent, this stops being a private conversation in a driver's briefing and becomes a public credibility problem for race control. Watch how the stewards handle the first contentious call of the Dutch Grand Prix weekend. If the standard shifts even slightly in Hamilton's favor, you'll know exactly why.